In this video, we're going to talk about using the WIIM Ultra like a pro with some secret settings. In my opinion, the WIIM Ultra is probably the product of the decade because everything that it can do and the price that it can do it at. It's got a ton of DSP. Actually, it's got about as much DSP as the mini DSP. And oh yeah, it has a fully functioning streamer inside. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, maybe through your new cheap Audioman coffee mug that's linked in the description, and let's talk about these secret settings that lets you use the WIIM Ultra like a pro. So WIIM as a company kind of burst on the scene about 3 or 4 years ago with the WIIM Mini. It was a little puck that cost about $80. And the reason why it's awesome is because it's a gapless streamer, a high-res gapless streamer. And at the time, it was coming in at a price that was actually lower than Bluetooth receivers, and still kind of is. But you can stream Amazon Music, you can stream Tidal, you can stream Qobuz, amongst other music services, losslessly. So no Bluetooth, no Chromecast, no AirPlay. You can stream the music natively at its full high-res wonderment. After the WIIM Mini came out, they released the WIIM Pro, which is basically the same thing, but a little bit larger footprint, had some regular size RCAs, had some more options for inputs and outputs. Then they came out with the WIIM Pro Plus, which had a better DAC inside to make it sound even better. Then they came out with the WIIM Amp, which had all of the functionality, but with a speaker amp inside. Then they came out with the WIIM Amp Pro. Then they came out with the WIIM Ultra. And in my opinion, the WIIM Ultra is a product that we had all been waiting for. Has a screen, has a bunch of DSP, subwoofer output, and it all comes in at $330. And if that wasn't enough, there are a ton of settings in the WIIM Ultra that I use as a YouTuber, but that you could also use to make better decisions about the gear that you want to purchase or keep. And there's also even more settings that I continue to learn about because WIIM continues to do updates at a breakneck speed. Probably already know about this setting, but it's the room correction. But you may not know there are multiple settings within the room correction setting. So room correction is super easy to use. You use your phone as the microphone, and after you run it, it'll give you an EQ. And then you can save the EQ, and you can name it whatever you want. Room correction 1. Create. And then you're done. Now, within the room correction setting itself, once you go back into it, there's a little gear wheel up here. You click on the gear, and it gives you a bunch of different options. Which frequencies you want to allow it to equalize, the max gain of the equalization, and then the max Q of the equalization. And the Q is basically how much or how little you will allow the EQ to affect surrounding frequencies. That makes sense. And then you have different smoothing options. 3, 1/3 of an octave, a 1/6 of an octave, and a 1/12 of an octave. And then there is a beta option down here where you can do multiple measurements in multiple positions. And an option to also test the subwoofer along with it if you have a subwoofer hooked up to your system. At the top of the room correction settings, there is a target curve. It gives you 3 different curves to choose from. B and K, Harman, or flat. The best advice I would give you is just to listen to each one and see which one you like the best. However, I have noticed that when I run the room correction on the WIIM Ultra, there's a tendency to kind of neuter the mid-range a little bit and it pulls out a little bit of detail, in my opinion. But what you can do is go into the actual EQ profile and you can start playing around with some of those frequencies. I would recommend 400 hertz, 500 hertz, maybe 1000 hertz, maybe 2000 hertz. So you can play around with the different settings within the room correction EQ itself to get exactly the right sound for you. And then you can save that EQ as to whatever you want it to be. Room correction 1 modified so it sounds better. That could be the name of it. So this is a setting that I use quite often when I'm comparing two speakers, and that is in the audio settings menu. So you just click that and it will give you a bunch of options. But right down here where it says audio channel, that's the one that I use. It says stereo, or default it says stereo. What I do, I switch it to mono. Why in the world would I switch it to mono? Well, I'm glad you asked. If I'm comparing two speakers, I put one speaker on the left-hand side and one speaker on the right-hand side. And since I'm running them both in mono, I can turn them on with the same amplifier with the same DAC. And then the only thing that I do is I take the balance slider and I go from left to right and right to left to hear the differences in those speakers. That's also a really great setting to see if the sensitivity rating of those speakers is accurate. So if you have two speakers, one has a sensitivity of 85 and the other has a sensitivity of 87, and you're going back and forth, and the speaker that says it has a sensitivity of 85 is playing louder than the speaker that has a sensitivity of 87, well then you know the speaker company that said their speaker is 87 dB sensitive are a bunch of liars. They're liars. Mostly for me though, this is just a quick and easy way to compare two speakers with everything else created equally because it's the same amp and the same source, and find out how they sound different from one another. So use your WIIM Ultra like a pro with mono. I use multiple WIIMs to compare amplifiers, and you don't have to have two WIIM Ultras. You can have two WIIM Pros or two WIIM Pro Pluses. But what I do is I will play a track and then I will link those two WIIMs together. And then those WIIMs will go out to different amplifiers. And then I'll use an amplifier switcher like the Duke VU3. It's my favorite speaker and amp switcher, and it has VU meters on the front. It's a lot of fun. So this is a way that you can compare the sound of two amplifiers if you have a switcher. You can also compare the sound of two different DACs if you have two of the same amps. And I know that sounds absurd, but a lot of times people will have two ZA3s or two WIIM 807 Maxes, which can be run in stereo and they can be run in mono. So if you have two of the same amplifiers and you have two WIIM Pros or two WIIM Ultras or two WIIM Pro Pluses, then you can hook up two different DACs and then you can go quickly back and forth and hear the differences. Now this is a bit of an unorthodox way of using two WIIMs linked together. And that is to use one WIIM, probably a WIIM Pro, as a wireless subwoofer transmitter. But more importantly, a wireless subwoofer transmitter and receiver with DSP. I do use a wireless subwoofer kit and it's from SVS. It's called the SoundPath. It's $120. Well, a WIIM Pro is $120 a lot of times when it's on sale. Now it is more complicated to use another WIIM device to be a wireless transmitter and receiver for your subwoofer. But when you're playing a track, you can link these two WIIM devices together. And since the WIIM Pro doesn't have a subwoofer output, it does have RCA outputs though. So you'd run those RCA outputs into your subwoofer and just use the crossover in your subwoofer. And once you do that, you will be playing the thing that you're playing in your main system through your subwoofer at the same time. But you can also adjust the level within the WIIM device that's hooked up to your subwoofer. So in essence, you basically have remote control of that subwoofer through your app on your phone. But more importantly, you also have access to a parametric or a graphic EQ. So if you have some bass issues in your room, some of those can be mitigated because of the EQ that you're using on the subwoofer. Not to mention that, but you can also play around with timing on that subwoofer to make sure that you have the timing or the delay just right to sync up with your main speakers. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, and this is a bit of a power user kind of setting. But if you just think about it as having a bit of a mini DSP hooked up to your subwoofer with something that's half the price of a mini DSP and the same price as a wireless subwoofer kit, it gets pretty compelling. This last setting is one I didn't know even existed till last night on my Zoom, on my patron Zoom, which, by the way, if you want to become part of the best hi-fi community in the world, check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/cheapaudioman. We have a Facebook group, we have a Discord server, and then we do Zoom meetings every other Sunday where you can chit chat with me and other people that are smarter than me. This is another EQ setting. You go into the parametric EQ setting. Now this is my room correction setting. At the top of there, you will see this setting, which is PEQ mode, and that's in stereo. However, you can select that, and there's a little drop-down menu that says L and R, and then you can hit that button. And now what you have access to is a different EQ for each speaker. So if you have one speaker that's in the corner and you're getting a bit of room gain on the bass from that speaker because of its placement, you can actually go in and make an individual EQ for each speaker, which is truly incredible. Now, if you want to get really into this, you can use a free software called REW and a microphone. It's called the WIIMs Pro mic, I think, and I think Dayton Audio also has a microphone that's a calibrated microphone. So what you would do is you would measure both speakers and then see how they match up, and then you would take response from each speaker and then you would use that to design your EQ. But a better way to do it is simply listen, and you can use that mono hack to listen to the same thing out of each speaker and then just swing left and right. And when you go left, if it's got a lot more bass, you can start playing with the EQ to get it down, because let's face it, the best microphone are your ears, because you're going to dial it in how you like the sound. But whether you're using REW and a calibrated microphone or your calibrated ears to do it, I think there's a ton of benefits to EQing your speakers individually. But all these settings are kind of like having a mini DSP, but having it at half the price and having a streamer inside. A lot of these settings aren't going to be for everyone because they're a little bit complicated, and you're going to have to play around with it quite a bit to make sure that you dial it in just right. But if you have the time, the inclination, if you have speakers that are in different positions, especially if you have an open area next to one speaker and maybe walls next to the other speaker, I think this is a crazy feature that everyone should use to further mitigate the room interaction with your speakers without ever having to hang up any type of room treatment. WIIM is constantly updating their devices and oftentimes unlocking these really cool features and not even talking about it. So if you're a WIIM power user and there's settings that you use all the time that a lot of people don't know about, please put it in the comments. But yet another reason to buy a WIIM product. Even if you don't use the streamer, you can buy it for the DSP. It's bananas. If you're in the market for a new pair of speakers, you may want to check this video out where I talk about 13 different speakers that kind of fly under the radar but are still awesome. Some of them are a little bit long in the tooth, but that means a lot of times you can get a good deal on them. I will link that video right here. So don't binge watch anything on Netflix or Hulu. Binge listen and maybe play around with that WIIM product that you may already own and use some of these secret features like a pro and fill your soul with happiness. And with that, I'm Randy. I'm the Cheap Audio Man.